3 men dead. A blue Range Rover sat abandoned on a farm track near Rettendon, and somewhere in Essex, a killer had walked away into the darkness. The murders shocked Britain. The newspapers called it gangland execution. Television crews descended on Essex, and within days the case was dominating headlines across the country. But for Essex police, the reality was far less dramatic, because despite the media attention, they had almost nothing. No murder weapon, no eyewitness willing to identify the killers, no confession, no obvious forensic breakthrough. Just 3 dead men, and a growing list of potential enemies. Over the months that followed, detectives would investigate countless leads. They would examine drug deals, business disputes, personal grudges, organised crime connections, and allegations stretching across the criminal underworld. Some leads went nowhere, others created more questions than answers. Then a man came forward, a man who claimed he knew exactly what had happened, a man whose evidence would eventually help convict 2 men of murder. His name was Darren Nicholls. And nearly 30 years later, his testimony remains one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Because while the courts accepted his evidence, others have spent decades arguing that the truth about Rettendon remains hidden. Did Essex police solve the murders, or did they simply find an answer? Tonight, we follow the investigation, the arrests, the trial, and the controversy that refuses to die. This is the Essex Boys, Part 2, Justice or Mystery. Welcome back to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. I'm your host, Matt. You can find the show across social media at WhatTheyHidePod, and email the show at whattheyhidepod@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, you'll find the Buy Me a Coffee link in the episode description. And if you enjoy the show, please consider following, reviewing, and sharing the podcast. Before we begin, a reminder that this episode contains discussion of murder, organised crime, and violence. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Right, let's crack on with the show. When Essex police launched their murder investigation, the scale of the challenge became immediately apparent. 3 victims, a bloody crime scene, numerous criminal associates, and a huge amount of media pressure. Detectives quickly realised they were dealing with something far more complicated than a straightforward homicide. The victims weren't ordinary members of the public caught up in random violence. They were men connected to a world where rivalries, allegations, and criminal activity frequently overlapped. That meant almost everybody they knew had to be considered. Friends, associates, business partners, former partners, rivals, people who owed them money, people they allegedly owed money to. The suspect pool was enormous. Investigators began gathering statements, analysing telephone records, tracing movements, examining financial relationships, and attempting to reconstruct the final days of the victims' lives. The inquiry eventually became known as Operation Sentry, one of the largest murder investigations ever undertaken by Essex police. Hundreds of statements were collected, thousands of hours of detective work were completed, and yet progress remained frustratingly slow. The crime scene itself offered surprisingly little. The killers had left behind few obvious clues. There was no straightforward path leading investigators directly to a suspect. And as weeks became months, pressure mounted. The public wanted answers, the media wanted arrests, and the family wanted justice. But despite the enormous effort being invested into the investigation, detectives still lacked the breakthrough they desperately needed. Then everything changed. Because eventually officers began receiving information from a man operating within the criminal world itself. A man who claimed he knew far more than he should. A man named Darren Nicholls. And his story would alter the course of the entire investigation. Every major murder investigation has a turning point. A moment when a case that appears stalled suddenly begins moving forward. A witness comes forward. A confession is obtained. A piece of evidence is discovered. Something changes. For Operation Sentry, that turning point arrived in the form of a man named Darren Nicholls. To supporters of the convictions, Nicholls helped expose the truth behind one of Britain's most notorious gangland murders. To critics, he became the embodiment of everything that can go wrong when a prosecution relies heavily upon a criminal informant. Even today, nearly 3 decades later, opinions remain deeply divided. And understanding why requires understanding who Darren Nicholls was. Unlike the victims, Nicholls was never a household name. He wasn't the subject of newspaper profiles. He wasn't portrayed in films as a larger-than-life gangster. Yet his role in the story would ultimately become just as important as any of the men found dead in the Range Rover. Nicholls moved within the same broad criminal environment that surrounded many of the individuals connected to the case. He was not an outsider looking in. He was somebody familiar with the people, the relationships and the culture investigators were trying to understand. That fact immediately made him valuable, because detectives were facing a problem common to many organised crime investigations. People knew things, but very few people wanted to talk. Fear has always been one of the greatest obstacles in gangland investigations. Witnesses worry about retaliation, associates worry about consequences, and criminals rarely volunteer information to police. The wall of silence can be extremely difficult to break, yet eventually, information began reaching investigators through Nicholls. Information that appeared significant. Information that detectives believed brought them closer to identifying those responsible. Over time, Nicholls provided accounts of conversations, relationships and events that prosecutors would later argue connected Michael Steele and Jack Womes to the murders. The details were complex, the investigation was extensive, and prosecutors would eventually build a case that relied heavily upon what Nicholls claimed to know. From the perspective of detectives, this represented a major breakthrough. For months, Operation Sentry had struggled to identify a clear path forward. Now they had a witness offering information from within the criminal world itself. The challenge, of course, was credibility. Because criminal informants present investigators with both opportunity and risk. On one hand, they often possess information inaccessible through traditional policing methods. On the other hand, they may have motives of their own, motives that are not always obvious. Detectives therefore faced an important question. Could Nicholls be trusted? At the time, investigators believed the answer was yes, or at least they believed enough of his account could be supported by other evidence to justify moving forward. As the inquiry continued, attention increasingly focused on 2 men, Michael Steele and Jack Womes. The evidence being assembled pointed investigators toward them, and eventually, arrests followed. From the outside, it appeared that Operation Sentry had finally achieved the breakthrough it needed. The case was moving. Suspects had been identified. The prospect of a trial was becoming real. But beneath the surface, questions already existed. Questions that would grow louder in the years ahead. How much of the prosecution case depended upon Nicholls? How reliable was his information? What were his motivations? And how thoroughly had his claims been tested? Those questions would become especially important after details emerged concerning his dealings with sections of the media. Years after the trial, it became known that Nicholls had received payments connected to newspaper stories about the case. The revelation generated considerable controversy. Critics argued that any financial incentive potentially affected credibility. Supporters of the convictions pointed out that courts had examined the issue and ultimately upheld the verdicts. The debate continues to this day. And this is where the Essex Boys case begins to move beyond a simple murder investigation. Because many controversial cases involve a single central fault line, a point upon which almost every argument eventually rests. For the Rettendon murders, Darren Nicholls became that fault line. Supporters of the convictions often view him as a crucial witness whose evidence helped expose the truth. Critics often view him as an unreliable witness whose testimony should never have carried such weight. Both sides can point to arguments. Both sides can point to evidence. Both sides can point to court decisions. And that is precisely why the debate has endured for so long. The legal system ultimately accepted the prosecution's case. The jury heard the evidence. The courts considered appeals. The conviction stood. Yet public debate didn't end when the verdicts were delivered. In many ways, it had only just begun. As Operation Sentry gathered momentum, detectives became increasingly convinced they had identified the men responsible. The investigation was now moving towards its most dramatic stage. Surveillance, evidence gathering, arrests, charges, and eventually one of the most closely watched murder trials of the decade. Michael Steele and Jack Womes were about to find themselves at the centre of a case that would define the rest of their lives. But who exactly were they? How did they come to the attention of investigators? And what evidence convinced prosecutors that they were responsible for the murders? To answer those questions, we need to examine the two men Operation Sentry ultimately placed at the heart of the Rettendon killings. Michael Steele and Jack Womes. By the time Operation Sentry began gathering momentum, detectives believed they were moving closer to identifying the people responsible for the murders. Months had passed since the bodies of Tony Tucker, Tate and Craig Rolfe were discovered near Rettendon. Hundreds of leads had been examined, countless hours of investigative work had been completed, and gradually, attention was narrowing. The names that increasingly appeared at the centre of the inquiry were Michael Steele and Jack Womes. In the years that followed, both men would become permanently linked to one of the most controversial murder cases. Their names would appear in newspapers, courtrooms, documentaries, appeals, and countless debates about whether justice had truly been served. But before they became defendants in a triple murder trial, they were simply two men operating within the same broad world that surrounded the victims. A world where criminality, business, reputation and personal relationships frequently overlapped. A world where people often knew one another through mutual associates, and a world where police investigators believed violent disputes could escalate rapidly. Michael Steele was older than many of the individuals involved in the case. He had a reputation as an experienced figure within criminal circles. Some associates viewed him as influential, others viewed him with suspicion. Like many figures who later became associated with organised crime investigations, stories about Steele varied depending on who was telling them. Jack Wholmes occupied a somewhat different position. Younger than Steele, he nevertheless found himself increasingly connected to the investigation as detectives followed emerging lines of inquiry. As Operation Sentry progressed, investigators began assembling evidence they believed linked the two men to the murders. Much of that evidence centred upon information provided by Darren Nicholls. According to the prosecution's case, Nicholls possessed knowledge that connected Steele and Wholmes to the killings. His account formed a crucial part of the narrative, eventually presented in court. From the perspective of detectives, the pieces were beginning to fit together. The victims had been killed in what appeared to be a planned execution. Potential motives were being explored, witness information was emerging, and investigators believed they were moving towards a prosecutable case. Yet proving a murder case requires far more than suspicion. Police needed evidence. Evidence capable of convincing prosecutors, capable of surviving scrutiny in court, and capable of persuading a jury beyond reasonable doubt. As the investigation intensified, Steele and Wholmes found themselves under increasing pressure. Their activities were examined, their relationships were examined, their movements were examined. Everything investigators could discover became relevant. Eventually, the inquiry reached a point where police believed sufficient evidence existed to move forward. Arrests followed. For detectives, it represented a significant moment. After months of investigation, they believed they had identified the men responsible. For Steele and Wholmes, however, the arrests marked the beginning of a legal battle that would continue for decades. From the very beginning, both men denied involvement in the murders. That position would remain unchanged throughout the investigation, the trial, and the years that followed. And this is where the story becomes particularly important, because it's easy looking back to assume that arrests automatically meant the case was solved. They didn't. An arrest is not a conviction. A charge is not a conviction. The prosecution still had to persuade the jury. And in a case as complex as Rettendon, that would prove far from straightforward. The evidence was substantial, but so were the challenges. Defence lawyers would question witnesses, question timelines, question assumptions, and question the reliability to key elements of the prosecution's case. Meanwhile, prosecutors remained convinced they had identified the correct suspects. The stage was now set for one of the most closely watched murder trials of the late 1990s. Journalists prepared for courtroom proceedings, families prepared for emotional testimony, investigators prepared to defend years of work. And at the centre of everything sat two men facing allegations that could result in life imprisonment. The stakes could hardly have been higher. If prosecutors succeeded, the Rettendon murders would officially be solved. If they failed, one of Britain's most notorious gangland killings might remain unresolved. The battle now moved from police stations and interview rooms to the courtroom, where every witness would be challenged, every piece of evidence would be scrutinised, and every assumption would be tested. Because solving a crime is one thing, proving it is something else entirely. And as the trial began, 12 jurors would be asked to answer a question that still divides opinion today. Who killed the Essex Boys? By the time the case reached court, the Rettendon murders had already become one of the most talked about criminal investigations in Britain. For more than 2 years, detectives had worked to build their case. They'd followed leads, interviewed witnesses, analysed evidence, and assembled the prosecution that would eventually be presented before the jury. Now everything came down to one question. Could the Crown prove beyond reasonable doubt that Michael Steele and Jack Wholmes were responsible for the murders of Tony Tucker, Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe? The trial would take place at the Old Bailey, one of the most famous criminal courts in the world, a court associated with some of Britain's most serious and high-profile cases. The setting reflected the significance of what was being alleged. This was not a single murder, not a spontaneous act of violence, but the execution-style killing of 3 men whose deaths had already become the subject of national attention. As proceedings began, the prosecution set out its case. Their argument was straightforward in principle, even if the evidence itself was complex. Prosecutors alleged that Steele and Wholmes had carried out the murders. They argued that killings were linked to disputes within the criminal world, and they presented evidence which they said connected the defendants directly to the crime. At the centre of that case stood Darren Nicholls. By now his role had become critical. Without him, the prosecution's narrative would look very different. With him, prosecutors believed they could explain not only who committed the murders, but why. Nicholls provided evidence that prosecutors argued was both detailed and credible. He described information that investigators believed only somebody with genuine knowledge would possess. For the prosecution, his testimony represented a major pillar of the case. But the defence saw things differently. From the very beginning, lawyers acting for Steele and Wholmes attacked the reliability of the evidence, particularly the evidence provided by Nicholls. Witness credibility has always been one of the most important issues in criminal trials. A jury may accept a witness, reject a witness, or accept some parts of an account while rejecting others. Everything depends upon whether testimony is believed. Defence lawyers therefore focus significant attention on motive. Why was Nicholls speaking to police? Could he benefit? Could he gain anything? Was his account reliable? The prosecution, meanwhile, maintained that the evidence was trustworthy and supported by the wider investigation. As the trial progressed, jurors were presented with a vast amount of information: witness testimony, investigative findings, timelines, associations, phone evidence, relationships between key figures. Like many organised crime prosecutions, the case was not built around a dramatic forensic breakthrough. There was no video recording of the murders, no confession from the accused, no witness standing before the jury claiming to have watched the shootings take place. Instead, the jury was asked to examine a collection of evidence and determine whether the prosecution had proved its case. That distinction is important, because later, debates about the convictions often focus on exactly this point. Critics argue the case depended too heavily upon witness evidence. Supporters argue that the totality of the evidence was sufficient to justify conviction. The jury's task was to weigh those competing arguments. Day after day, testimony continued. Journalists reported developments. Families listened. The defendants maintained their innocence. And eventually, after hearing the evidence, the case moved towards its conclusion. The judge delivered directions to the jury. Jurors retired to consider their verdicts, and Britain waited. For the families of the victims, the wait must have been agonising. Nearly 3 years had passed since the murders. 3 years of grief, 3 years of uncertainty, and 3 years of questions. For Steele and Wholmes, the stakes were obvious. If convicted, they faced life imprisonment. If acquitted, one of Britain's most notorious murder investigations would suffer a devastating setback. The jury deliberated. The evidence was examined. arguments were considered, and eventually a decision was reached. Michael Steele was found guilty. Jack Wholmes was found guilty. Both men were convicted of the murders of Tony Tucker, Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe. The verdicts marked the end of the trial, but they didn't mark the end of the story. Far from it. For Essex Police, the convictions represented confirmation that Operation Sentry had succeeded. The investigation had identified the killers, the case had been presented in court, and the jury had delivered its verdict. For the victims' families, the convictions brought a form of resolution. The legal process had reached its conclusion. Justice, at least in the eyes of the court, had been achieved. Yet even as the trial ended, questions remained. Some observers continued to doubt aspects of the prosecution's case. Some continued to question the role played by Darren Nicholls. Others wondered whether every detail of the official narrative had truly been established. At the time, those doubts existed largely on the fringes. The verdicts had been delivered, the court had spoken, the case appeared closed, but appearances can be deceptive. Because over the years that followed, new arguments would emerge, new challenges would be launched, and the Rettendon murders would become one of the most fiercely debated criminal cases in modern Britain. The convictions were secured, the prison doors closed, and most people assumed the story was over. In reality, the controversy was only beginning. Because some people believed the jury had reached the correct verdict, others believed the wrong men had just been sent to prison for life. When Michael Steele and Jack Wholmes were convicted, many people assumed the Essex Boys' story had reached its conclusion. 3 men had been murdered, 2 men had been convicted, the investigation was complete, the trial was over, the case appeared closed. But some cases refused to stay closed. The Rettendon murders would become one of them. In the months following the convictions, the public spotlight gradually moved elsewhere. New crimes dominated headlines, new investigations captured attention, and for most people, the Essex Boys case became another chapter in Britain's criminal history. Yet behind prison walls, Steele and Wholmes maintained their innocence. Their position remained unchanged. They had not committed the murders, the verdicts were wrong, and the fight to overturn those convictions would continue. At first this was hardly unusual. Many convicted prisoners claim innocence, many launch appeals, most are unsuccessful. But over time, the Rettendon case began attracting a level of scrutiny that few murder convictions ever experience. Questions emerged, then more questions, and eventually the entire investigations would be devoted to examining whether the official story truly reflected what happened. One of the earliest areas of controversy centred upon Darren Nicholls, the witness whose evidence had played such an important role during the prosecution. As the years passed, details emerged regarding payments connected to newspaper stories about the case, information that had not featured prominently during the original trial. The revelation generated significant debate. Critics argued that financial incentives could potentially affect the credibility of a witness, particularly a witness whose testimony had become so important. Supporters of the convictions countered that the courts had examined these issues, that legal processes existed specifically to evaluate such concerns, and that the convictions had survived scrutiny. The disagreement highlighted a problem that would become central to the case. The same piece of information could be interpreted very differently depending on where somebody stood. To some observers, the newspaper payments represented a serious issue. To others, they didn't fundamentally alter the strength of the prosecution's case. The courts would eventually consider the matter, and despite criticism, the convictions remained in place. But the controversy didn't disappear. Instead, it expanded. Over the years, campaigners, journalists and private investigators began examining other aspects of the case. Timelines, witness statements, telephone evidence, disclosure issues, investigative decisions. Some believed these areas revealed significant problems. Others believed they simply reflected the complexity of a major murder investigation. As the debate intensified, a growing number of people became convinced that important questions remained unanswered. Among the most vocal were campaigners who argued that Steele and Holmes had suffered a miscarriage of justice. They pointed to inconsistencies they believed had never been properly resolved. They questioned aspects of the prosecution narrative, and they argued that alternative possibilities deserved greater consideration. At the same time, supporters of the convictions remained equally convinced. They noted that appeals had been heard, arguments had been examined, evidence had been reviewed, and yet the verdicts continued to stand. For them, the legal system had already spoken, repeatedly. The divide would become one of the defining features of the Essex Boys case. Not simply disagreement about details, but disagreement about the entire foundation of the prosecution. Was the case fundamentally sound, or fundamentally flawed? The answer often depended on who was asking the question. As the years passed, new voices entered the debate. Former police officers, journalists, authors, private investigators, documentary makers. Some supported the original investigation, others challenged it. Some believed the convictions were safe, others believed the wrong men had spent 3 years behind bars. The result was extraordinary. Instead of fading into history, the Rettendon murders became more controversial with age. Most murder cases become clearer over time. Evidence settles, arguments fade, public interests decline. The Essex Boys case followed the opposite path. The further people dug into it, the more disputed it seemed to become. Entire books were written questioning aspects of the case. Documentaries revisited the evidence. Campaigners continued pushing for reviews. And every new development seemed to reignite the debate. Yet throughout all of this, one fact remained unchanged. The conviction stood. Michael Steele and Jack Holmes remained convicted, and every challenge faced the same obstacle, the original verdict. Overturning a conviction is difficult. Overturning a conviction in a case that has already been extensively reviewed is even more difficult. That reality would shape everything that followed, because the next phase of the story was no longer about proving guilt. It was about proving doubt. And proving doubt can be every bit as challenging as proving guilt. As campaigners searched for answers, attention increasingly turned towards alternative theories, alternative suspects, alternative motives, alternative explanations for what happened on that isolated farm track near Rettendon. Some theories would gain supporters, others would collapse under scrutiny, and some would remain trapped forever in the grey area between possibility and proof. But one thing was certain: the official story was no longer the only story being told. And as the years passed, the battle over what really happened at Rettendon was only becoming more intense. By the early 2000s, the Essex Boys murders should have been over. 3 men had been murdered, 2 men had been convicted, the courts had spoken, and for most criminal cases, that would have been the end. But the Rettendon murders refused to stay buried. The further people looked into the case, the more questions seemed to emerge. Questions about witnesses, questions about timelines, questions about motive, and perhaps most importantly, questions about whether investigators had uncovered the full story. Now, before we go any further, it's important to be absolutely clear. What follows are not proven facts. They're not court findings, and they're not conclusions. They're claims, theories, arguments raised by campaigners, journalists, former investigators and documentary makers over the years. Some people find them compelling, others dismiss them entirely, and throughout all of this, one fact remains unchanged. Michael Steele and Jack Wombs remain the men convicted of the murders. The convictions still stand. But that hasn't stopped people asking questions. The first question concerns motive. According to the prosecution case, the murders were linked to a dispute surrounding cannabis importation, a drug deal, money, and a relationship that had deteriorated. The jury accepted that explanation. The courts later upheld the convictions. Yet over time, some observers began questioning whether the motive really explained everything. 3 men had been killed. Not 1, 3. The attack appeared organised, efficient, professional, and for some people that raised a difficult question. Was this really just a dispute over a cannabis shipment, or was something larger taking place behind the scenes? That question would become the foundation for many of the alternative theories that followed. One theory suggested the murders may have been connected to much larger organised crime interests. Supporters of this idea pointed toward the vast amounts of money moving around through criminal networks during the 1990s. Drug trafficking, debt collection, protection rackets, armed robberies. The argument was not necessarily that investigators arrested the wrong people, rather that full background to the murders might never have been uncovered. Some documentary makers and independent investigators later argued that the motive could have been far bigger than the one presented in court. But despite years of speculation, no court has accepted an alternative motive, and no new charges have ever been brought. Then came one of the most controversial claims of all, the idea that the murders may have involved individuals who were never prosecuted. Over the years, various former detectives, journalists and researchers have publicly suggested that other suspects deserved closer scrutiny. Among the most high-profile examples were claims explored by private investigators and documentary makers working on later investigations into the case. Some argued that evidence pointed towards entirely different individuals. Others suggested the actual gunman may never have been identified. One anonymous witness, featured in a later documentary, even claimed that the murders were linked to organised crime disputes involving money from a major armed robbery. That claim attracted significant attention, but it remains exactly that, a claim. It has never been proven in court. No one has ever been convicted on the basis of it, and investigators involved in the original case strongly rejected the suggestion. Another anonymous source claimed the murders were effectively a contract killing, that Tony Tucker was the primary target, and that the other 2 victims died because they happened to be present. Again, the story generated headlines, again it attracted supporters, and again it remains unproven. One of the most interesting aspects of these theories is that many of them contradict one another. Different people point to different motives, different suspects, different explanations, which creates its own problem. If everyone agrees the official story is wrong, but nobody agrees on what the correct story is, how should that be interpreted? Then there is the question of Darren Nicholls, because regardless of which theory somebody supports, most roads eventually lead back to him. His evidence helped secure the convictions, his credibility became central to the case, and years later, revelations about media payments connected to his story created fresh controversy. Critics argued jurors should have known more. Supporters of the convictions argued the court examined those issues and still upheld the verdicts. Disagreement remains unresolved, and perhaps it always will. Then came the mobile phone evidence. Campaigners argued that the certain call records raised questions about parts of the prosecution timeline. Supporters of the convictions argued those questions changed very little. The courts examined those arguments. The convictions remained. Again and again the same pattern emerged. Questions were raised, arguments were heard, the verdict survived. Yet each challenge added another layer of uncertainty, another layer of debate, another reason for people to keep digging. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Essex Boys case is not that theories exist. Most famous murders attract theories. The remarkable thing is how long those theories have survived. Nearly 30 years later, people are still arguing about the same questions, still debating the same evidence, still searching for the same answers. And that tells us something important. Not necessarily about guilt, not necessarily about innocence, but about doubt. Because once doubt enters a case, it can be very difficult to remove. And in the Essex Boys case, doubt became almost as famous as the murders themselves. Most murder investigations eventually fade from public memory. A verdict is reached, the headlines disappear, the years pass, and the case slowly becomes a historical footnote. The Rettendon murders followed a very different path. Instead of fading away, they grew. The story expanded beyond the courtroom, beyond police files, beyond witness statements, and over time the Essex Boys murders became something far larger than a criminal investigation. They became a cultural phenomenon. Today, millions of people who have never read a court transcript, never studied the evidence, and never examined the original investigation, still feel familiar with the case. Not because of the trial, but because of the stories that followed. Books, documentaries, films, television programs, podcasts, newspaper investigations, each offering its own version of events, its own interpretation, its own theory. And with every retelling, the line between documented fact and criminal folklore became increasingly blurred. Perhaps no film has influenced public perception of the case more than Rise of the Foot Soldier. The film introduced an entirely new generation to the Essex Boys story. It was violent, stylised, memorable, and hugely successful. For many viewers, it became their first exposure to the names Tony Tucker, Tate and Craig Rolfe. But there is an important distinction. Rise of the Foot Soldier is entertainment, not evidence. While inspired by real events and real people, it takes dramatic liberties. Characters are amplified, events are condensed, conversations are imagined, and reality is often reshaped for storytelling purposes. There's nothing unusual about that. Most crime films do exactly the same thing. The problem arises when audiences begin treating dramatic portrayals as historical fact. Because once a story enters popular culture, it can take on a life of its own. The real Pat Tate becomes mixed with the cinematic Pat Tate. The real Tony Tucker becomes mixed with the cinematic Tony Tucker, and eventually the mythology becomes larger than the reality. The films were not alone. Numerous books appeared over the years. Some supported the official version of events, others challenged it. Some claimed insider knowledge, others argued the investigation had missed crucial information. Authors became investigators, investigators became authors, and everyone seemed to have a theory. One particularly influential figure inside the wider Essex Boys story was Bernard O'Mahony. His books and commentary helped shape public understanding of the case for many years. Supporters viewed his work as valuable insight into the criminal world surrounding the murders. Critics questioned some of the claims and conclusions. The debate reflected a broader problem. Almost every source connected to the case attracted supporters and critics. And because so many key figures had links to the criminal world, certainty was often difficult to achieve. As the years passed, television documentaries began revisiting the murders. Some focused on the victims, some focused on the investigation, others focused on the possibility that the wrong men had been convicted. Among the most influential was Sky's The Essex Murders. The series explored not only the murders themselves, but also the controversy that followed, the appeals, the competing theories, the continuing arguments about what really happened. For many viewers, it was the first time they encountered the idea that the case remained disputed. And that is one reason the documentary proved so important. It shifted the focus away from the murders alone and toward the uncertainty that followed. At roughly the same time, investigative journalists and researchers continued pursuing their own inquiries. Perhaps most notable were investigations carried out by former detectives, journalists and researchers associated with independent projects examining the case. Some believed important questions remained unanswered. Others believed fresh evidence might still exist. That result was extraordinary. Decades after the murders, people were still actively investigating them, still analysing evidence, still debating timelines, still searching for answers. Few criminal cases maintained that level of interest for so long. And yet the Essex Boys case seemed incapable of disappearing. Part of the reason is simple. The story contains all the ingredients of a compelling crime narrative: violence, money, organised crime, mystery, controversy. But another reason far more important: the central question remains unresolved in the minds of many people. Not because the courts failed to deliver a verdict, the courts did. Not because nobody was convicted, people were, but because uncertainty survived the verdict. And uncertainty has a remarkable ability to keep a story alive. Every documentary asks new questions. Every book proposes new answers. Every investigation uncovers new disagreements. And so the cycle continues. The Essex Boys murders are no longer simply a case. They're a subject, a phenomenon, a story continually re-examined by each new generation. Yet beneath all the books, all the films, all the documentaries, all the theories, 3 facts remain unchanged. Tony Tucker is still dead. Pat Tate is still dead. And Craig Rolfe is still dead. Everything else is debate. And perhaps that is why the story endures. Because despite nearly 3 decades of investigation, argument and analysis, many people still believe the most important question has never been answered. What really happened at Rettendon? For years, the Essex Boys murders existed largely as a story about the past, a crime frozen in December 1995. But while the murders remained in the past, the debate surrounding them continued moving forward. Campaigners continued challenging aspects of the investigation, researchers continued examining the evidence, journalists continued revisiting the case, and supporters of Michael Steele and Jack Wholmes continued arguing that the wrong men had been convicted. Meanwhile, the legal position remained unchanged. The convictions stood. Appeals were heard. Arguments were examined. Reviews were conducted. Yet the verdicts remained in place. As the years passed, both convicted men spent decades behind bars. Jack Wholmes was eventually released from prison in 2021 after serving more than 20 years. Michael Steele remained in prison for longer, eventually securing release in 2025 after serving approximately 27 years. Their releases generated renewed media attention. For some observers, the story appeared to be reaching its conclusion. The convicted men were now free. The murders were decades old, and most of the major participants had either passed away or moved on. Yet the controversy refused to disappear. Supporters of the convictions continued arguing that justice had been served. Campaigners continued arguing that serious questions remained unanswered. And so the unusual situation continued. The men convicted of the murders were no longer in prison, yet the arguments surrounding the murders remained very much alive. Perhaps that is the most remarkable aspect of the Essex Boys case. Nearly 30 years after the killings, people are still asking the same questions. Who really ordered the murders? Why did they happen? Did investigators uncover the full truth? And if those questions remain unresolved in the minds of many people, what does that say about our understanding of what happened at Rettendon? Because while the legal story may have ended, the debate never did. And that brings us to the final question at the heart of this entire case. What do we actually know? Nearly 30 years have passed since the bodies of Tony Tucker, Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe were discovered on a lonely farm track near Rettendon. 30 years of investigations, 30 years of court hearings, 30 years of books, documentaries, arguments, theories and speculation. Yet despite everything that has been written and said about the Essex Boys murders, the central question remains remarkably simple. What really happened? Not what people believe happened, not what films portray, not what rumours claim. What actually happened? In some ways we know a great deal. We know 3 men died. We know they were murdered. We know their bodies were found inside a blue Range Rover near Rettendon on the morning of the 7th of December 1995. We know Essex police launched a massive investigation. We know Michael Steele and Jack Womes were convicted. We know the conviction survived repeated legal challenges. Those facts are not in dispute. But beyond those facts, the picture becomes less clear. The further we move from established evidence, the more uncertainty begins to appear. And uncertainty has shaped this case from the very beginning. Perhaps that was inevitable. The victims lived in a world built on secrecy, a world where people lied, a world where people protected themselves, a world where information was currency. When murder enters an environment like that, certainty can be difficult to achieve. Witnesses may be unreliable. Rumours spread quickly, stories change, and facts become buried beneath competing versions of events. The Essex Boys case contains all of those problems. Over the years, supporters of the convictions have pointed to the verdicts, the evidence heard by the jury, the decisions reached by the courts. For them, the legal system examined the case and reached a conclusion. The matter is settled. Others disagree. They point to disputed evidence, witness credibility, questions surrounding the investigation, and alternative theories that continue to circulate. For them, the story remains unfinished. Both positions continue to exist, and both are likely to remain for many years to come, because this case is no longer simply about guilt or innocence. It has become something larger, a debate about truth. How do we know something happened? What evidence should we trust? How much uncertainty can exist before confidence begins to disappear? These are questions that extend far beyond Rettendon. They sit at the heart of every controversial criminal case, and perhaps that explains why the Essex Boys murders continue to attract attention. Not because people are fascinated by gangsters, not because people enjoy conspiracy theories, but because uncertainty makes us uncomfortable. We want answers, clear answers, definite answers. Yet sometimes life refuses to provide them. Sometimes all we are left with are fragments, pieces of a puzzle that never quite fit together perfectly. And perhaps nowhere is that more evident than on that cold December morning in 1995. A farmer discovers a vehicle, a blue Range Rover, alone on a remote farm track. Inside sit 3 dead men. The countryside is silent, the winter air is cold, and nobody yet understands that the discovery will become one of the most famous crime scenes in British history. In that moment there are no documentaries, no books, no films, no internet debates, no competing theories, only a crime scene. Everything else comes later. The arguments, the headlines, the convictions, the appeals, the controversies. All of it begins with that single discovery. And perhaps that is where we should leave the story. Not with certainty, not with speculation, not with a claim to know more than we do, but with a simple acknowledgement. 3 men lost their lives. Families lost sons, brothers, friends, and a case that should perhaps have faded into history instead became a permanent part of British criminal folklore. Whether the full truth was uncovered remains a matter of debate. Whether every question was answered remains a matter of debate. But the murders themselves remain real, the victims remain real, and the consequences remain real. Long after the headlines disappeared, long after the courtrooms emptied, long after the cameras moved on, the questions remained. Maybe they always will. Because some mysteries are solved in law, and some mysteries continue to live in the minds of those who cannot stop asking questions. The Essex Boys case sits somewhere between the two. A story of violence, power, money, fear and uncertainty. A story that began on a lonely farm track in Essex and never truly ended. This has been the Essex Boys. Thank you for listening. And that's where we're going to leave the story of the Essex Boys. If you've listened through both parts of this series, thank you. I genuinely appreciate you spending your time here with me. A huge thank you to everyone supporting the podcast, whether you're listening in the UK, Ireland, the United States, Canada, Australia or anywhere else around the world. Thank you for helping What They Hide continue to grow. A special shout out this week to Dave in Glasgow, Rachel in LA, Steve in Bristol, Emma in Melbourne, Connor in Belfast, Mike in Vancouver, Kate in Dublin and James in Norwich. Thank you all for listening and for your support. If you'd like to support the show directly, you'll find the Buy Me a Coffee link in the episode description. You can also find me across social media at What They Hide Pod, and if you have a case suggestion, feedback or information relating to any case we've covered, you can email me at whattheyhidepod@gmail.com. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider following the podcast, leaving a rating or review, and sharing it with somebody who enjoys true crime. Those small actions make a huge difference and help more people discover the show. Next time on What They Hide, we'll be uncovering another hidden crime, another mystery, another story where the truth isn't always what it first appears to be. But until then, take care of yourselves, look after each other, and remember, sometimes the darkest secrets aren't buried underground. They aren't hidden in locked rooms, and they aren't concealed behind masks. Sometimes they're hiding in plain sight. This has been What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. I'm Matt. Thank you for listening.